So, a Retina 3C, small c. Let's have a look at this one. It's got lumpy and bumpy, a few Zeiss bumps on the base there. That's a little bit unusual. Usually doesn't mean good things. The leatherettes on the front of the camera appear to be pretty good. Short, no bumps there. A few bumps on the back. Some brown spots there. I'm not sure whether that's leatherette gone and I'm seeing something stuck in there or not. Anything else to note? Well, the viewfinder is exceptionally cloudy. I'll have a look out the window. Yeah. Rangefinder, exceptionally sluggish to return to the infinity position and very, very cloudy, extremely hard to see through. The exposure meter. Now, this is buggered up. The door's taped down here. The hinge on the casting here is broken away, I'd say at a guess. Or the pin might just be displaced. Let's see, is it even reacting to light? There's a bit of tape holding that down, so let's get that off. That's not going to help. So the door, what can we say about that? Well, the door's damaged here. There's definitely been hit the ground or something like that, or somebody's opened the flap and pulled it right back. The spring here is not tucked in correctly, so it can't possibly activate that door. That door's a real funny shape. Does the meter respond to light? Well, yes it does. It's a bit weak. It's probably never ever going to be accurate, but it does work. So with that in mind, it's probably worth sorting out the door issue here so that the camera displays correctly. I wouldn't rely on that meter for giving me any guide as to correct exposure, that's for sure. So what else can we say about this? Does it cock? That's a funny sound. And the advanced lever is very reluctant to return to the rest position. And surprise, surprise, the shutter's not cocked. So I would say at a guess that the shutter cocking rack is damaged. So I suppose we'll have to find out exactly what's gone on and potentially, well, we'll see if we can repair it, I suppose. Would help if I had the right screwdriver in front of me, of course, but that would be too easy. Let's make do with the wrong screwdriver. It fits those screws, just not the one that I would normally use to do that job. Top cover off. Let's have a look at this. Okay. First thing to notice, crosshead screws here and here. Well, they're foreigners. Second thing to notice, the window here, that's odd. That's not original. That's lost its original piece there that held that window in, and it's not the original window. So the camera has had some alterations, improvements, I'm not sure what to say really. It's not original. Some nasty scratches around here. The frame counter does seem to work reasonably. Bit stiff. That's not a good thing. If the frame counter is very stiff, it means that the load on the cocking rack will be higher than otherwise. And if the load on the cocking rack is higher than it should be, well, then it's more likely to fail. Let's remove the exposure meter so we can see the state of that shutter cocking rack on the top of the camera there. And what can we see? Okay, that's done, that's toast. I'll zoom you in a little bit. Yeah, I think you can see that shutter cocking rack there. And you see what happens as I move the film advance lever. Click, 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 click. And then we're back to the start again. So the shutter cocking rack is pretty devoid of teeth in this area here. That's not good. Very likely the gear on the top of the film advance here has got some wear on the teeth at that point. Now that's on it's got a square in there, it sits on the top of the squared shaft. So even if you've got one bad tooth, given that this only swings through about 180 degrees, you can usually position that gear so that the bad teeth never actually come in contact with your rack. But this camera is going to need a new rack. So, shall I delve in a bit deeper? It's already obvious that someone's been in here playing because of the top cover and the improvements made there. The question is, how deep did they go into this camera and what other things did they do? Let's remove the rangefinder. The rangefinder is certainly not happy. Let's have a look at that. Yeah, you'll see that the arm here on the rangefinder, let's zoom back out again, you can see nothing. That's better. See the rangefinder here. That arm returns reluctantly and not completely. It's just gummed up. And I think it would be useful to have that shutter cocking rack out and just see if the film advance otherwise moves correctly, because it's somewhat reluctant to return to the rest position. So there could also be other faults there. Faults that have been induced by misuse and faults that are going to be permanent. Let's see what happens. No, that moves entirely normally. So our problem with our film advance was strictly down to this absolutely ruined shutter cocking rack. I'm looking at the state of this to see if someone's already had a go at fixing this. The whole rack here is covered in dirty grease. It's got quite a pronounced scour mark across here. That's where it would have been rubbing against that support bracket, and obviously that was, I would say that must have been tight, or this was deformed, so it's been pulled over tight towards it. But that rack has had it. It's not damaged just at this point. At that point, obviously, the gear was just clicking over it like some sort of ratchet. But it's not just damaged there. The very first tooth at this end is damaged. That, typically to do that, what that means is that the shutter cocking rack was stuck out somewhere like that. The film advance lever had come round. This had stopped moving. The film advance lever was pushed back to home, and of course once it got back as far as here, this was too far back because it was one or more teeth out from where it should have been, and basically this damaged the front of those teeth at the end there. So the damage at the end of the teeth on this rack, that's definitely induced. It was induced by someone forcing the film advance lever back to the rest position when it didn't want to go. At that stage, the damage to the cocking rack itself may or may not have been fatal. It means that something had skipped a tooth at this point. It may mean the cocking rack was ruined at that point, or it may mean that it needed some attention and it might have been salvaged. I want to remove that chrome trim, because one thing I want to check here is to see if these screws are tight here. That one's loose. Now these two screws, they hold the bush for the top of the film advance in position. If they are loose, there's enough play in the system that you end up with too large a clearance between your shutter cocking rack and the gear. The gear here is effectively able to push away from the shutter cocking rack. It looks to me like that's pretty much the case. Let's slacken that screw off so we can move things. Yeah, you can see how much movement I've got there. Well, if it's at that extremity, the teeth are only touching fairly close to their tips. They're not moving as they should do. Ideally, they want better engagement than that. So, potentially at least, potentially, this had slipped. If attention had been given to it at that point, it might have been possible to resurrect that rack. When the teeth get a little bit distorted and damaged, you can frequently true them back up and have a working shutter cocking rack again. These ones are just beyond it, but it's certainly possible in many cases. So, well, that's interesting. I don't think there's going to be anything else entertaining here to tell you, so we're just going to leave it there at the moment. When I come and put it back together with a new shutter cocking rack, I'll demonstrate making sure that that engagement is good, and that gear on the top of the shaft is good for that matter. Well, with just about everything stripped out of the camera body, I thought I'd check to see how that shutter cocking rack moved in the body. As I said, there's quite a pronounced scuff mark here, and especially on the inside there. So I'm just checking to see how much clearance there is there at that bracket, and that is quite stiff. There's no doubt in my mind that this was creating drag. It would have been quite stiff. It's quite likely that, given how stiff that was, that the film advance lever probably never was especially keen to return to the rest position, even before the rack itself had completely stripped. So yes, that was certainly a partial cause for failure here. You can probably see that the nickel plating is rubbed right through to the brass there. That's quite rough, that surface. That's had quite a lot of wear on it. And it's rubbed through the plating at that point too. So definitely the position of that bracket is probably pushed up too hard against the rack and creating the drag at that point. Anyway, I'll get back to taking this thing to pieces. It's all got to be stripped and cleaned. Well, I've got this completely stripped. As you can probably see, there's a large amount of grit and dirt in there, and dried grease, of course. Likewise in the back of the camera, the usual infestation of film chips and dirty old grease. And something of interest, see if I can get this to even show. There's a tiny piece of glass here. Now that tiny piece of glass would have come out of the top cover, and it would have been the window in here. So when that was broken, pieces of it fell into the camera. Now that tiny little fragment there, that's enough to do serious damage, because what happens is when you've got something like that loose in the camera, it can frequently find its way in between gears, or jam a lever to stop a lever moving through its full travel. And so I would not be at all surprised if not necessarily this particular piece, but another piece like it, was the root cause of that shutter cocking rack failing. You only need a small fragment like that to lodge in the gear somewhere, and stuff just doesn't want to move at the end of the chain, and if you put all the usual force at the front end of the chain of gears and there's something locking it up at the back, that's something's going to give. and frequently, of course, it'll be the weakest link. And the weakest link here is commonly the shutter cocking rack. When everything's running nicely, there's no problem with that shutter cocking rack, but it will rapidly show up a problem where problems exist somewhere else. Right, this exposure meter. See if I can do anything about this door. Let's have a look at it. Well, that's just fallen off completely. The tabs at the end are a little bit bent out of shape. The pins on the casting look okay. That pin there is definitely bent. I really need to get that pin out in order to straighten that up. And it's been, the end of it's damaged at this end slightly. It's been mushroomed over, so I think someone's driven it in from this end. Ideally I want to move it in that direction. Because of that bend, if I try to pull it back, almost certainly that'll jam and I'll end up breaking the casting. I really can't afford to break the casting. I'll try cleaning up around those edges slightly with a file and see if I can drive that pin forward. Normally you can just push them forward. It's very reluctant. I'll have to see what I can do. If I can get that pin out, it won't take much effort to straighten this damaged door up, get that squared up. The ends here are just a little bit bent out of shape. If I get that squared up, the spring's still here and present. I could be happier about the shape of the way that spring's sitting at the moment, but I can deal with that. So if I can get that rod out, I can square up that spring and I'll be able to put this back together and get that door opening and closing like it's supposed to. But I've got to get that rod out first. I just need to take the burr off that pin so that it will pull through the hole in the casting. Of course it's probably spring wire and it's fairly hard, I think. Oh no, perhaps not. Okay, let's see if I can rotate that. That'll probably do. Let's see if I can actually work this out now. Oh, it's moving, but it doesn't want to come all the way out. This pin may be slightly bent at the end here too. It's a little bit out of shape. I do have another option. If I can find the pin from another meter, I could cut the pin across inside here and then pull the ends out, and that would certainly work too. Yeah, that pin is slightly bent, so it's slightly bent at both ends. It's coming. It's coming. Right. I'll remove the spring so I don't damage it. Let's have a look at it. Okay. So that pin has got a crimp in it. So in an ideal world it would have come out at that end, but of course it couldn't because it was too badly bent at this end to feed it back through. See if I can straighten that. No. Not a prayer of getting that dead straight, I'd say. Okay, I'll have to pull that right up through. If I file that crimp down, I can pull that through. Let's try that. It's not keen. Can I take it back out the other way? Not enthusiastic about my chances with this one. Okay, we've got it out. I'll have to do a little bit of work on this to straighten that pin out. But it's out. And the spring's out, it's intact. And the door. Well, I can see the door's got a twist in it. So I'm going to untwist that. That's easy. And see if I can straighten up these ends. One of these has a round hole, one of them has a slot in it, and the slot's there so that you can press this down on the shaft and allow it to rotate as it unclips from the frame. Right, how's my rod? Is it straight? Not really. Let's just see if it'll go through there. And I want to see if the door will actually hinge okay. Push that through a little bit further, do I? There may have been a spacer in here. I can see space there. I think there was a spacer that's missing. That would have stopped that door from floating. Definitely. Okay. So if I can find a spacer for another metre, I can probably get that to go. Let's push that pin through a bit further. It's reluctant, isn't it? Yeah, see if it hinges. It will, but it's missing the spacer. Unless someone's put the wrong door on there. That's a later style of door. I'll see what I've got. It's going to need parts one way or the other. Well, I've got the pin, the spacer and the spring from a good one here. Well, a parts camera. I'll see if I can fit them to this meter. Which way has this got to go? I think that goes there. Now I've got to put at least one turn of tension on this spring. Well, it's not going to do its job. Oh, it's a wiggly thing. That looks like it might work. Now, can I get the door on there? I've got to get that spring hooked up around the inside of that door. I need better tweezers than this. It's sitting where it needs to be. Can I get the spacer in there? Get the door back up. Press the pin into position. And what have we got? Well, we've got a meter door that doesn't really want to stay latched in position very well, but it is a bit mutilated down at this point. That spring needs to lift that door up to keep it latched in position. It's not really doing that particularly well. I have to say that's not at all uncommon, of course, with these meters, but we do have a working flap there now anyway. I really don't think I could wind another turn of tension on that spring. I don't think that would work. I think we'll call that a success. Call that a win. And those other little bits can go back into my collection of dead exposure meters and pieces thereof to be used as a part source when something like this comes through the door that is simply just not complete. See if I can do something with that door to get that to latch in there a bit better. Yeah, it really doesn't want to lift up particularly well. If I can bend that crimp in a little bit. Somebody's already had a go at that. I don't know whether they've succeeded in improving it or not. I'm a bit reluctant to make a mess of it. Tricky. So I have the mechanism mostly back together now. I'm just checking the fit of the shutter cocking rack here, and what I'm looking at is the amount of clearance or play I've got at this point. You can see I can move the rack backwards and forwards. Let's take it about halfway down the stroke. It'd be something like about there, for example. And I'm just checking how much play I've got there. And that's an excessive amount. When that's at its extreme, the gear and the cocking rack are only touching right at the very tips of the teeth. And what will happen is that the load's been taken right at the very tips of the teeth. And it's likely to end up damaging those teeth. So what I'll do is I'll just make sure these two screws are slackened off, and I'll push that shaft all the way over as far as it'll go. In fact, I'll take that rack out first so it's not blocking me. And I'll nip those two screws up tight. And I'll put that rack back in. And I'll see what I've got there, see if it's improved. I've still got quite a bit of play at that point. I'm not very pleased with that. Now there was something called a service replacement for this screw, this shoulder screw. And basically the head of the screw, the boss here, was a larger diameter. Only very slightly, but of course it has the effect of pushing the rack closer in contact with that gear. So I'll just see if I've got one in my spare parts, and we'll put it in and see what difference it makes. I've found what I wanted. Now the original part, measure across the head of that screw, that says 3.01 millimeters. And I've looked at the ones I've got there, and they vary from around about 300 millimeters to 3002. So that's a representative example. Here I've managed to find a service replacement. Now that measures 3.29 millimeters across the head. So it's very roughly, what's that, about 14, it's about 0.7, isn't it? 0.07 bigger. So I'm just in radius from the centre to the edge. So let's just put that screw in there and see what sort of result we get. So I'll just leave that loose, Oops. Bring that across as far as it'll go, do that up tight. Put the shutter cocking rack in, say about halfway down the stroke. Now, there's virtually no play there, there's just about no free play at all. That's ideal in that position. That would certainly work well. So, I'll put the shutter cock, well actually I won't, I'll lubricate that and then I'll put it in place. So I'll use some synthetic grease. I'll zoom you out a bit, I think I'm a bit closer here. That's better. Now of course the camera is all clean. It's been stripped and it's free from all the dried rubbish, grease and dust and stuff that was in there. And so everything moves freely. I checked the space here between the bracket and the rack and the case and left my customary 4/1000th of an inch clearance there and checked that that moved smoothly, and it did. So I'm pretty confident that will work out okay. get these little clamp down pieces in place and check that the rack moves smoothly. So I'll screw that post in loosely, and I have one screw here. It's not playing the game. We'll soon deal with that. Check that rack moves smoothly. That seems to be good. And this clamp down plate at this point, of course, goes on top of the chrome trim typically. So it's probably too tight if I just put this on here now. Let's run the screw on lightly. Oops. Got the chrome trim in place. I'm quite happy I've got everything where I need it anyway. That's better. I left the chrome trim off before to give me access to those two screw heads when I was seeing if I could get sufficient clearance just by adjusting the position of things. Right, what do we got? Wants to stick a bit at the end of the stroke. It might mean I need a shim washer underneath this bracket. That really made no difference at all, so it suggests that I need my shim washer at this point. So I will do that. I'll just slacken that off slightly. And it's at the post. Oh, most definitely, that's as smooth as silk there. So I need to put a very fine shim washer underneath this bracket at this point. I'll just find one in my washer collection and put that in place. Just slacken that off. Back that screw out. I have a fine shim washer here. Get it underneath, get that centered up, get the screw back in position. Can't see anything through my non-transparent fingers, can you? That's tough. Tighten up those two. Check that that was sufficient. Yes, the film advance is nice and smooth. No undue extra clearance at this point. I would expect that to behave nicely now. So that part of the camera body's dealt with really. I can put the door on. I can put the leatherette on the camera base and the tripod sockets around and back catch release cover. And then I'll put the body aside while I deal with the rangefinder, top cover and shutter. And I've got no idea what the shutter will be like inside. I know the rangefinder's sticky and I know the top cover's been buggered about with, and I'm very dubious about the state of those crosshead screws there. That may be fine. I'll put a drop of lacquer on those screw heads to make sure they don't come undone. But I will need to check the state of the knob at the top here. It turns quite smoothly. I'll just make sure that that's clean. At any rate, that's the main drama over with. Sorted that out. New shutter cocking rack was certainly required. There was nothing wrong with the gear on the top of the film advance shaft. There was nothing wrong with the gear on the transfer shaft, the bottom teeth of the rack contact. But the rack itself, that was done. That was really done for. These teeth here are just completely mutilated, and at the bottom those teeth are pretty good. There's a little bit of distortion on them, very slight. You can usually tell. You can tell if there's been distortion if you rub your finger across the side of the teeth. And if it feels rough, that means that metal's been pushed up, pushed out away from the teeth to the sides. And it means that if the metal's pushed out to the side, it's not on the front, on the contacting face of the teeth, so they're probably not the same shape they should be. You can push it back. Minor roughness like that, I would just simply smooth those teeth back down, and not with a file. I tap them down gently with a nice polished ball peen hammer, gently, to push that metal back onto the teeth, not squeezed out to the side. However, that one's done for because I can do good things, but I'm no magician. There's no danger I'm going to fix up those teeth. And so I've got to the other side of this job. I've a good Retina IIIc camera. Shutters all working nicely. That was all being cleaned. The blades were very, very oily in this particular one. That's not a problem. That's all been sorted. Everything opens and shuts. And generally speaking, it's a pretty sort of tidy looking camera, I think. So this one, I think, can go back to its owner. Of course, the extra cost for them is the cost of the shutter cocking rack, because the one that was in the camera is destroyed. But that's life as we know it. The main thing is, good working camera, going back home. Thanks for watching.